I can say that our people, without being stupidly optimistic, are full of confidence and are absolutely resolved.
Let us then move forward together in discharge of our mission and our duty, fearing God and nothing else.
Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
And this week, we're talking about something that many of us, including people in politics, have: political heroes. But first, we begin our podcast each week with a segment called Matters of Interest, where we discuss something we've read, learned, or listened to in the previous week that we found particularly interesting. So, Richard, why don't you share yours first?
Well, my matter of interest this week is the idea of international human rights with respect to the traditions of the Labour Party. Now, in the last episode, I mentioned that the historian John Bew would be giving a talk at the Policy Exchange think tank about the foreign policy of Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary of Clement Attlee, about whom Bew has written a biography. And I attended that talk, and it was a very interesting reflection on Bevin and the Attlee government's foreign policy. I have a great deal of respect for John Bew. I think he's a brilliant historian and speaker as well. But I would take issue in his biography of Attlee that he doesn't talk enough about Attlee's skepticism of certain grand international institutions. For one, there's almost nothing in the biography about Clement Attlee's Euroscepticism, even though Attlee was actually quite a vocal opponent of the common market well into the 1960s. He gave speeches in the House of Lords on the topic. He wrote articles in major newspapers opposing the common market. He even gave a television interview where he talked about his opposition to the common market. Additionally, I think the Attlee Labour government's suspicion of the idea of human rights as detached from the nation state could be explored a bit more thoroughly. Yes, Labour was instrumental after the Second World War in being part of the establishment of many of the institutions of the international liberal order. But I would say that the Attlee government was suspicious of the idea of human rights detached from the nation. Labour was an internationalist party, and the nation element of internationalism shouldn't be overlooked. The institution is called the United Nations, not the United Humans. And Labour advocated for the idea that, yes, we can come together collectively as nations to agree to protect certain rights, but not necessarily to hand over the enforcement of that protection to individual judges against nations, with those judges not carrying their own political legitimacy. And it may seem as a subtle difference, but I think it's really quite an important one. The Attlee government was really quite ambivalent about the European Convention of Human Rights. In fact, Attlee's Lord Chancellor, Lord Jowett, said at the convention, quote, "Any student of our legal institutions must recoil from this document with a feeling of horror. I cannot believe that any lawyer would accept such a document for a moment unless he thought that the political advantages outweighed the legal disadvantages." There's been a brilliant PhD written by a young academic from SOAS called Sanjit Nagy on this topic. And Sanjit has also an article coming out in the journal Public Law later this year called Reframing the Debate, the Attlee Government, Untrammeled Sovereignty, and Socialistic Reasons for Resisting the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, I raise all of this because, not just because of the historical points that John Bew raised in his lecture, but also because I believe that the current Labour government has really quite a different view on international human rights law than the Attlee Labour government. In particular, I'm thinking of Keir Starmer, David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, and Lord Hermer, the Attorney General. And my reading of their view is that even if international law defies our national interests, our primary duty is to respect international law. But I don't think that really was the Attlee outlook. Of course, the Attlee outlook wanted to work with other countries and to hold the highest standards. But ultimately, they understood that they were an elected government there to serve the British public, and that the interests of the British state should prevail. And I think that that's something that Labour shouldn't be afraid to stand up for in the years to come. So, Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
So this week, I want to talk briefly about electoral pacts. As some people may have seen, there was recently a front-page splash on the Sunday Express saying Tories call for Reform Pact to save the UK. And the suggestion is that some senior Conservatives have said that Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage should work together to prevent this Labour government being re-elected. There are a couple of points I wanted to make about this, though. Firstly, I think people, and in particular journalists, have become addicted to the rapid pace at which politics has moved in recent years. And to be running headlines now when the next election could easily be 4.5 years away, suggesting that there has to be some sort of electoral pact between the two parties, is frankly mad. So much could change between now and the next general election. For one, it's perfectly possible that Farage may exit the scene, and Reform is, despite the efforts of some of its MPs, still pretty much a one-man band. And if Nigel Farage was not around at the time of the next election, I think that would have serious consequences for Reform's electoral performance. Similarly, the political climate may move away from some of the issues like immigration, where Reform have been very strong and had very clear messages, and more towards, say, the economy, where in truth they've got relatively little to say. So that's the first point. I think it's enormously premature to be having a conversation about electoral pacts at the next general election. But let's imagine that wasn't the case, and let's think for a moment that the election was close. Then there's a question of, is it the right discussion to even be having? There have been plenty of times over the years when parties have been on their knees and somebody has floated the idea of an electoral arrangement. For example, after the February 1974 election, when the Tories were evicted from office, there were some people in the Conservatives who wanted an arrangement with the Liberals to get Labour out. The Liberal Party at the time was led by Jeremy Thorpe, one of the most fascinating and scandalous figures in post-war politics. But in February 74, Thorpe had managed to increase the Liberal vote share to 19.3%. That was up by 11.8 percentage points. And that was in part driven by the Conservatives falling by 8.5%. And so in the aftermath of that, several Conservatives, including Nigel Lawson and Ian Gilmore, proposed that there should be some sort of electoral arrangement between the two to try and get the person who they assumed was their mutual enemy, Harold Wilson, out of office. What appealed then and what appeals to some people now is the attraction of a short-term arrangement where you can almost add up the votes of two different parties and assume that they will combine to take out another. But that's almost always mistaken. There are plenty of Conservatives who would not vote Reform, and plenty of Reform people who would probably not vote Conservative. You can't just add the numbers up. But even if you could, that's the short term. There's also the long term to consider. And even if it were true that a pact might help get Labour out, Conservatives have to think about their own position as the principal party of the right and how to maintain that, not just over 5 years, but over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. An arrangement which made Reform a significantly larger party in Parliament, and in the event of a coalition, potentially even a party of government, would be a big threat to the Conservatives in the longer term. It would herald a permanent division on the right of British politics, and even if it happened to be well organised in one election, with Reform and Conservative candidates not standing against each other, it's perfectly possible that it collapses in the future, and they do stand against each other, in which case you'd have two rival parties of the right, one of which has been emboldened by a pact in the past, and that could easily let a left-wing party into government on a very low vote share. That's all to say that a pact in the longer term could make the British right weaker, whilst many people on the right today are saying it's essential. So what can we say about electoral pacts? One thing I think we should say about them is that they should be discussed, if at all, at the right time. This is frankly an absurd time, And the second thing is that even if you are discussing them, you've got to think of the long-term and the short-term consequences. The most profound consequences of all are certainly going to be those that outlive the immediate electoral cycle.
Thank you very much, Lee. This week, we're exploring the question, what makes a good political hero? Now, last year, Lee, you wrote an article in Unheard called The Conservative Party Needs a Hero. The subtitle of the piece was Thatcher Alone Won't Rescue Them. Now, I know authors don't write their own headlines. I've learned that from bitter experience. But can you briefly, first of all, explain why you wrote this article, why you singled out Thatcher as someone who the Conservative Party has become too dependent on, and why are we talking about this topic this week?
Absolutely. So the motivation for writing that article was a series of quick-fire Q&As that Conservative Central Office did with the leadership candidates in the last Conservative leadership race. It's worth just running through who the candidates chose. So Priti Patel said, without hesitation, Margaret Thatcher. Robert Jenrick said the same, and then added her ideological guru, Keith Joseph, and also her most dynamic chancellor, Nigel Lawson, in for good measure. Kemi Badenoch was arguably the most interesting, so she plucked for Ery Neve, the former leadership campaign manager for Thatcher and the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who was assassinated in 1979. And Neve is a fascinating figure. He was also, on a slight tangent, one of the people who was detained in Colditz, and I think he was, in fact, the first person to escape from Colditz during the Second World War. But he was a remarkable figure.
And my understanding is that out of all of the candidates, to the extent that they mentioned British politicians, they either chose Thatcher or one of her close allies. Why do you think they were so dependent on that Thatcher era to name their political heroes?
At this moment in time, I think that Thatcher has a very particular appeal and resonance within the Conservative Party. In some sense, it's never gone away, but I think it's very strong, actually, recently. Part of that is just for the obvious point that she was the last highly consequential Conservative Prime Minister, not just because she was in office for 11 and a half years, which is a remarkable feat by any measure, but also because of what she managed to do during the time that she was Prime Minister. Whether listeners agree with her or not, it's pretty hard to deny the consequences of her premiership, in particular on the economy, with a new settlement with trade unions, the liberalisation of much of the economy, the big bang in the City of London. And hers was a truly transformational premiership. And then I think there's a sense in which the Conservative framework has never really moved on from Thatcherism. Her worldview, her way of thinking, really still dominates the party today. And although there have been at times some green shoots of new thinking within, shall we say, the Conservative family, Brexit was arguably an example of that. Thatcher took us into the single market. A generation later, the Tories took us out of it. That was a chance to rethink Britain on the world stage that was never really taken up. And then there's a whole levelling up agenda, another break, I think, or potential break, from what would have been the Thatcher paradigm within the party. And when Boris Johnson, in particular, spoke about levelling up, it was a real compelling vision of what the British economy and the British state could look like in the years ahead. But ultimately, it didn't materialise. The grand vision of a balanced economy ended up being fulfilled by relatively small pots of money to do at market halls in English regional towns. I mean, the delivery didn't match the ambition. And so whenever you've had these moments, I think, of green shoots within conservatism, which could potentially remake the party, potentially remake the way in which Conservatives think about themselves, and also have the ability to transform the country, they've not really been seized upon. And so the dominant way of thinking within conservatism is still very much along Thatcherite lines. It's largely her language, largely her agenda that dominates. And so in that context, it's hard not to really look up to the woman who gave you the creed that you still largely follow. So that's how I'd roughly explain why Thatcher appeared so regularly on these lists.
So you have Priti Patel, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch naming Thatcher and friends. Who did the other candidates choose?
Well, this is where things go global. So Tom Tugendhat, who of course himself is a former lieutenant colonel of the British Army, He picked another fellow military man turned politician, Dwight Eisenhower, who became US president after the Second World War. Mel Stride, the current Shadow Chancellor, who at the time was, I think, a bit of a surprise candidate in that contest. He went for an even more surprising choice. He went for John F. Kennedy. And James Cleverly opted for the sunny and optimistic Ronald Reagan. They had three candidates choosing Thatcher or Thatcherites, and then three candidates remarkably choosing American presidents.
So what do you think that says about British politicians today? I mean, why did so many name American presidents? To be honest, I suspect a fair few Labour politicians, if asked the same question, might do the same. So what's this fascination with the American presidency?
I must say I was surprised by it. It's one of those things, it's a bit difficult when you look at a list of heroes as a collective, because individually each one is probably a perfectly respectable answer. But when you look at it as a group, certain patterns and trends stand out. And the American domination, shall we say, of this list is interesting, surprising, and actually a little disappointing, I think, as well. The Conservatives can claim 22 prime ministers since the Great Reform Act, including Disraeli, Baldwin, and Churchill. But instead we get Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Reagan. It's surprising. I would think it speaks to a couple of things. Firstly, a political culture which is too American. So news from the United States very often dominates headlines over here in the UK. And in some sense, that's inevitable because of America's power compared to almost any other nation on earth. But I've long thought that this domination of British news is too much. I mean, when did we last hear about an event going on in New Zealand politics in the news, for example? New Zealand has no codified constitution like us, uses a Westminster style of parliamentary democracy like us. But we basically never hear about what's going on there, even though it has so much in common and so much shared history. Similar things could be said about Canada and Australia and many other countries. Instead, we spend our time thinking about America, and so it plays this oversized role, I think, in our political imagination. The other factor, I think, that we see with quite a lot of senior politicians is this draw to American politics, because it is such big money, it is such high glamour, and of such importance that I think it's almost irresistible for a politically minded person. If politics is show business for ugly people, as is sometimes said, then America is just such a bigger stage with bigger budgets and a bigger audience that I think it sort of pulls people in. Now, that's not to say that any of those three former leadership candidates were necessarily of that view. And I definitely wouldn't want to call them ugly people wanting to be in show business. But I think there is something about that, both how much American news we absorb and also the comparative drama and glamour of American politics that sucks the politically minded person in.
The other thing that I found quite striking about these choices is they are all post-Second World War, and the British choices are obviously all political figures of the 1970s and 1980s in particular. So we're talking about really quite a recent time span when, of course, theoretically they could have chosen from any figure in history. So why do you think that the choices were really relatively proximate to our present politics?
You're entirely right. So everybody on the list was alive within living memory. And politicians labelled Tories can be dated back to the 17th century. So I think that almost certainly speaks to how recent our appreciation of political history has become. And that's a great shame. I mean, we can think about some of the other iconic conservatives over the centuries who could have been mentioned. Benjamin Disraeli, for example, is basically the founder of the modern Conservative Party. And Disraeli makes a fascinating man, descended from Jewish immigrants from Italy. He climbed up the greasy pole, as he himself called it, through a process of personal and political reinvention. He became a beacon for Victorian Britain, really. And he remade the Tory party in the late Victorian period in his own image and to his own design. And that's one of the ways, in fact, that he could be a hero for the Tory party today. Through his internal party reforms, he set up what was called the National Union of Conservative and Constitutional Associations. He laid down the blueprint for what would become Conservative Central Office. He basically revitalised and redrew the party map so that it could become not just the dominant party at the end of the 19th century, but the dominant party way into, and in fact, in the end, throughout the 20th century as well. So I think there's people like Disraeli, to pick a really obvious one off the top of my head, who goes slightly further back through the canon of Tory figures, who really would have been a very good person for this list.
Another curious omission was Winston Churchill. Churchill is such an iconic figure. He's one of only 3 prime ministers to be given a state funeral. The others were William Gladstone and the Duke of Wellington. So has Churchill fallen out of favour in the modern Conservative Party?
The omission of Churchill is really striking, because after all, he's not just a conservative political hero. He's really a national hero. I mean, people who are our age or older might remember that show Greatest Britain that the BBC did back in 2002, in which people were asked to vote on who they thought the greatest Britons ever were. It's a list that really gives away the fact that it was coming at the very early part of this century. I mean, Diana, Princess of Wales, for example, comes 3rd on this list of greatest Britons, ahead of Isaac Newton, ahead of William Shakespeare. It's not something I think would happen now. But Churchill comes top. That Churchill is picked as the greatest Briton. And I think actually not that many people would go against that. And of course, there's all of his wartime achievements, which of course we can't go into now, we wouldn't have time, but which are very profound. There are also little things that he did that are relevant to the Conservative Party's predicament now. So one of the great landslide defeats for the Conservatives in the last century was, of course, the 1945 general election. Churchill led the party into that election, and rather than leaving the scene afterwards, he stayed with the party in opposition. And 5 years later, under his leadership, the Tories gained 90 seats and were on the brink of returning to power again. They did, in fact, come back into office a year later. Now, interestingly, no other post-war Conservative leader would make as many gains in a single election as Churchill until David Cameron did in 2010. So even if you don't look at the really obvious things about Churchill, there are reasons to pick him as a Conservative icon and Conservative lodestar at this particular time.
Although I will say that Winston Churchill led the Conservatives into 3 elections, and in terms of popular vote, Labour won more votes than the Conservatives all 3 times under Clement Attlee. But you are right, and Churchill is an iconic figure that in some ways stretches beyond party allegiance. In that programme you mentioned about the Greatest Britain, the presenter who made the case for Winston Churchill was the Labour cabinet minister Mo Mowlam, sort of a iconic figure in her own right of the centre-left. So we've talked about Disraeli, we've talked about Churchill. These are clear heroes that were omitted from the list of the Conservative leadership candidates. Who else do you think they ought to have considered in their pantheon of political heroes, particularly thinking of those in the Conservative Party?
It's a very good question. And if I limit my thinking really to people who are good heroes to have at a time like this, a time of renewal, a time of really pressing challenges for a political party, somebody I would chuck in there would be Rab Butler. So he is most famed, I think, for missing out on being Prime Minister so many times. He very nearly became Prime Minister in 1953. He came much closer still to being Prime Minister in 1957. And a lot of people thought he would become Prime Minister. And in fact, he could have been if he'd forced his own will in 1963. But he was always the bridesmaid, never the bride, so to speak. But one of his great achievements in politics came between 1945 and 1951. And they really make him the hero of the party rebuild. Rab Butler was head of Conservative research and policy. He set about attracting the best and the brightest people on the centre-right to engage with the party. He led very bold programmes to help educate the grassroots about political issues of the day and to try and create a really comprehensive new agenda that would take the party into the second half of the 20th century. Butler's great insight, really, and this is something the Tory party could definitely learn from today, was to recognise that the new context in which they were operating post-war was wholly different from the way in which they had governed before the war. And to follow his lead today would really be to avoid redeploying the playbooks of the 1980s or even the 2000s, but to look really with fresh eyes at the challenges of the 2020s. That's obviously a much harder task. I mean, so much of what we're talking about today is about looking back and seeing inspiration. And in many ways, that's easier than trying to craft and carve out a totally new agenda from fresh. But that is, in fact, what Butler was able to do after the Second World War. And it's what set the Conservative Party back on the course to office. But really, I mean, we've discussed the Tory side a great deal. I think we should turn to Labour. And really, I wanted to ask you, Richard, if the Tory challenge at the moment is to try and find a way to do opposition well, Labour's great challenge is to govern well. And importantly, to govern not just for a single parliament, but to win again as well, something which has often been a struggle for Labour parties to get a full second term in office. So who would you say are the right people to be Labour's great heroes at a time like this?
Well, I think for this particular moment, actually, that question was answered in the 2020 Labour leadership contest when Keir Starmer was asked by the New Statesman who his political hero was. And he said Harold Wilson. Now, I suppose what Starmer may have seen that was attractive in Wilson was Wilson's reputation for a certain degree of political flexibility. The Labour MP Tom Swain once said that Wilson was so devious that, quote, if Harold swallowed a sixpence, he'd shit a corkscrew. But I think the lesson that Starmer maybe didn't fully take from Wilson is that, yes, Wilson did have a reputation for being someone who could be pragmatic and flexible. And ultimately, this was seen as the way that he held the party together and also positioned Labour to win 4 elections under his leadership. But I think perhaps a lesson that Starmer hasn't really learned from Wilson is that Wilson was always seen to have a political base in the party. That Wilson emerged from the left of the party. He, of course, dramatically resigned with Nye Bevan and John Freeman from the Attlee government over the introduction of some fees in the NHS. And all throughout his political leadership, including his time as Prime Minister, of course, he did things that upset the left, and he got into some terrific rows with people on the left. But they always understood that Harold was their friend and vice versa. And I could tell you what I think Harold Wilson's basic political orientation was. I'm not sure that I can say the same about Starmer. So you can't just be devious in politics, I think, to be successful. I think you also have to have some sense of driving vision and principles. And so at the moment, I think Keir Starmer has probably learned half the lesson of his hero, Harold Wilson. And I think that he needs to still work on learning the full story there.
Wilson is almost a focus group response to that answer in a way, in that Labour is so often, I guess, deeply factional, including about its own past. But what do people know about Wilson? Well, obviously he was part of the left in his early career, but then not necessarily associated with it much later on. And so he doesn't really give too much away in the way that if he had stood up and said another Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, Tony Blair, Ramsay MacDonald, it would have given away much more about Starmer, I think, to that Labour Party electorate than saying Harold Wilson. I've always been interested in how Labour views its own past and its heroes. So last year we marked 100 years since the election of the first Labour government. But the man who led it into office, Ramsay MacDonald, is really a villain and not a hero in the Labour tradition for his role in forming a national government with the Tories in 1931. And so clearly there's this struggle within Labour history. And even some of the people who achieved the most for the Labour Party, as I think it's undeniable that MacDonald did, don't always get the praise and the applause that they deserve. So thinking about how Labour views its own history and how Labour understand its own figures, heroes or villains, who do you think the great standout heroes are for Labour as seen within the party tradition?
Well, Labour is, in certain ways, a very nostalgic party. And you're right that Labour, I think, both loves its heroes and loves to have villains to hate. And Ramsay MacDonald is, in some ways, the great villain par excellence of Labour Party history. The Labour Party does love a good story of betrayal and treachery, and MacDonald's decision to, in effect, abandon the Labour Party and go into government with the Conservatives in 1931 is almost the kind of founding or one of the very early myths of betrayal in the Labour Party. There are, of course, other figures that betrayed Labour or seen to betray Labour. Of course, Oswald Mosley at that time, who left Labour and went to the kind of the far right. And more recently, a lot of the Labour MPs in the 1980s who joined the SDP became hate figures in their own right within the Labour movement, people like Roy Jenkins in particular. And I think it's worth thinking about the heroes of earlier Labour politicians. Michael Foot is a really interesting person in this regard. Foot wrote a book in 1986, so this is after he had been Labour leader. It's just as he's he had a long wind down in politics, but this is now he's back on the backbenches, and he writes this book called Loyalists and Loners. And this is a book of people who are not particularly, I would say, necessarily his heroes, but they're politicians that he thought were compelling, led interesting lives, had interesting things to say, and that, in a certain sense, the newer generation of politicians that he might have been writing for now as he was sort of getting on himself, could learn something, both in their failures and successes. And it's a really interesting and, I think, eclectic list. He has chapters on 4 prime ministers: David Lloyd George, Stanley Baldwin, Ramsay MacDonald, and Winston Churchill. Among the Labour politicians, he writes a lot about the people he knew in politics: Barbara Castle, Hugh Gaitskell, Jenny Lee, George Brown, George Thomas, Fenner Brockway, David Owen, Tony Benn. He includes a couple of Tories, Enoch Powell, who was actually a personal friend of Foot, and Nancy Astor. Foot was also a very literate man, so he takes a lot of inspiration as well beyond sort of pure politics and looks at people who wrote about political ideas but weren't necessarily themselves politicians: George Orwell, Lytton Strachey. Now, most of his subjects are 20th century, but he has 19th century figures in the book too. William Lovett, the great Chartist leader, Alexander Herzen, the Russian proto-socialist writer of the 19th century, Stendhal, the French novelist, Winwood Reade, the British novelist in the 19th century. And he even has a chapter on a 16th century woman, Dorothy Wadham, the landowner who founded Foot's College, Wadham College.
You really do get there, I think, a sense of the richness of Foot as a character, actually, and his intellectual hinterland was immense. And even at the time, he would have stood out, actually, in politics, I think, and in Parliament, for how well-read he was, for how well-educated he was, for how thoughtful he was about issues, not just in politics, but in society and beyond. But it's really that should be a benchmark almost. In fact, we've not talked about Foot as a hero, and he's very rarely seen as a hero because of his relatively weak leadership of Labour and its poor performance in the 1983 general election. But Foot is a hero for the immense sort of breadth and thoughtfulness that he brought to politics.
Well, Foot is probably one of my greatest Labour heroes. I'm a great defender of his, and I've written a piece that's in Jacobin called "Before Jeremy Corbyn There Was Michael Foot," which makes the case that Foot was actually one of the most significant and substantial Labour figures of the 20th century. But Lee, why do you think we're having this discussion? I mean, why is it relevant or revealing to ask a person who their political hero is? I remember when I was in the Cambridge University Labour Club when I was undergraduate, this was always a question that one of our members used to put to every candidate for the executive committee. Do you think it's a useful thing to ask? Is it a useful exercise? Should we even want our politicians to have heroes at all?
I think the answer that people give to who is your political hero hints at a few things, certainly. It says what do they admire in others, and probably what do they want to see emphasized about themselves. So James Cleverly, for example, when he said Ronald Reagan, was doing so because of his sense of sunny optimism. And that's clearly both what he admired, but also what people wanted to see about Cleverly. So I think it's partly an act of projection. It can also tell us something about their approach to politics, I think. I mean, put bluntly, if you were interested in being a consensus politician, in building broad coalitions, you're not going to say Margaret Thatcher. It just would jar with the sort of politician you were trying to be. It also probably tells us something about the issues that matter to them. I mean, for example, if you're on the Conservative side now and you were to say Harold Macmillan, the likelihood is that you'd be thinking about his record not as Prime Minister, interestingly, or even Chancellor or Foreign Secretary, but as Housing Minister in Churchill's post-war government. Lots of people doubted whether or not he could build the target that was set of 300,000 homes a year after the war, but he did manage to achieve it. And it was one of his great triumphs. And so if you were to cite him as being your hero, that's probably a way of hinting that that's an agenda that you're interested in. It's also probably a sense test, I think, as well. In that, again, if you're an aspiring Tory, you would be mad to say Ted Heath. Nobody with their head screwed on would say Heath. There is just not the grouping within the party that is interested enough or loyal enough or admiring of him to really make that a sensible answer to give to a Q&A like the one that they did last year. Should politicians have heroes is a slightly trickier question, I guess, but I think so. But the key thing to remember, as with all history, is that political lives contain lessons but not answers. The circumstances aren't the same, the challenges aren't the same, the opportunities aren't the same as they were when you look back on somebody in the past. So absolutely be inspired by the heroes of the past. Knowing about them, knowing about their lives is an important way to learn about politics, but don't try and just be them, because I don't think that will ever work.
Well, perhaps our listeners can learn a little bit more about you, Lee. Who are your political heroes?
For years, I actually thought about this question when I was first thinking about politics and reading about it. And I'd sometimes pick up a political biography and think maybe this is the person who will become my great political lodestar. Maybe this is the person who I will think is the most outstanding politician who we should all look up to and try and follow. And I always came away concluding that they weren't. Because all politicians are human, of course, and politics is an impossible vocation in which to always make the right decision, to always make the right call. So I think it's a folly really to look for an absolute or total hero. But there are people I admire, and in fact I'll mention somebody who came up just then, so Harold Macmillan. I think Macmillan was a remarkable life. He wasn't unique in this, of course, but he was a real example of what his generation endured. He was born into privilege himself, but his time in Oxford was cut short by the First World War. He suffered a bullet through his hand at the Battle of the Loos and a bullet through his hip in the Battle of the Somme. He nearly died, and his handshake, his handwriting, and his walk never fully recovered. And he really carried the wounds of that generation. He was a deeply compassionate man, something I think we should generally look for in our politicians. When he saw impoverishment in his constituency of Stockton, he became a very passionate and vocal advocate of government support to address unemployment and poverty in the area. He was also, and this is something that I think is particularly relevant in recent years, when at times there's been a sense of ministers almost as being pushed around by their civil servants or dominated by the zeitgeist. Macmillan was a really competent minister. Now, I mentioned just before about the task he was set by Churchill in 1951 to build the homes for the people. It took a huge amount of administrative skill to pull that off, and not many people could have done it, but in fact he managed it. Macmillan also had something which I think is important in politics if you're going to be Prime Minister. He had a sense of Britain in the world and what sort of mattered and how to project Britain onto the international stage. So after Suez, he healed relations with the United States incredibly well. And he helped perhaps his biggest legacy in one sense, but one that we don't necessarily always think that much about, was shepherding that transition from empire to Commonwealth. And he really meant it. He did, in 1958, a 6-week tour of Commonwealth countries, including Australia and New Zealand and India and elsewhere. And in 1960, he did a tour about as long to Africa. In fact, it was during that tour that he made the Wind of Change speech. So he had a vision, really, for Britain on the world stage and worked to achieve it, which I think, whether you fully adopt that vision or not, is an admirable thing to see in a prime minister. He had many flaws as well, of course, but I think, Macmillan was really one of the great lives of the last century. And I admire his personal and political achievements a great deal. But like I say, it's very hard to really pick up somebody who you think, gosh, they were an almost infallible politician, because, of course, they don't exist. In which case, so I've got to ask, who is your great political hero?
Well, when I was an undergraduate and asked this question, my sort of cop-out answer to avoid arousing the hackles of one faction of the Labour Party or the other was to say my grandfather. But I became interested in the history of the Labour Party through my grandparents, who were lifelong socialists. My grandfather joined the Labour Party in 1935, the year that Clement Attlee became leader. And my grandfather remained a member of the party for the next 42 years until his sudden death in 1977. And my grandmother remained a person of the left, fascinated with politics, until her death many years later in 2011. And as I was growing up, my grandmother used to tell me these stories of these great Labour politicians of that period, from the sort of 1940s to the 1970s, when she and my grandfather were most active in politics. And in that time, my grandfather met many of those figures. He met Attlee. I have photos of him with Hugh Gaitskell and Nye Bevan. I have newspaper clippings about meetings he held with Dick Crossman and letters that he exchanged with Tony Benn and Shirley Williams and others. And so I sort of learned about the history of the Labour Party with reference to these big political figures, and then had this kind of interesting connection with them on a personal level with my grandfather. And I find so many of them compelling. It's difficult for me to narrow down a single political hero. I suppose my top tier would be Clement Attlee, Barbara Castle, Michael Foot, and Peter Shaw. But then there are actually, the more I think about it, there are so many others from those days that I just have such either admiration or respect for, or just find them to be fascinating or compelling figures. Some better known today than others, people like Judith Hart or Joan Lester, Anne Kerr, Richard Crossman, Nye Bevan, obviously Harold Wilson, Tony Crossland. I really could go on. I suppose the criteria for me about someone being a political hero for me is, were they someone who was driven by a strong sense of political convictions and principles? Did they have a keen and clear sense of the world that they wanted to work towards? And I think, secondly, were they prepared to get their hands dirty and muck in to try to achieve something of that world that they dreamed of through the processes of democratic politics? So I'm sort of skirting around and answer your question. I suppose if I had to name someone, I'd probably have to say Barbara Castle.
Okay, we'll take Barbara Castle. So we finished with a discussion of the books that we're reading at the moment. So, Richard, why don't you go first?
This week I've been reading a book called A Fabulous Failure: The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism by Nelson Lichtenstein and Judith Stein. Now, I think if you were to ask American politicians or the American public today on the left who they would identify as their political hero, I think the star of Bill Clinton has fallen quite a lot, both for the reasons of Clinton's personal behavior with respect to young women, but also because the analysis, I think, of the Clinton presidency is that this was a presidency which was one of a betrayal of, in American terms, liberal principles. And it's true that so many of Bill Clinton's policy achievements wouldn't be really viewed as achievements by Democrats today, whether that was Bill Clinton's commitment to end welfare as we know it, which entailed Bill Clinton abolishing aid for families with dependent children, basically the child benefit program that Franklin Roosevelt had introduced as one of the signature elements of the American welfare state as part of the New Deal, or Clinton's deregulation of the financial sector, or the crime bill that Clinton put forward, which increased penalties for petty crimes, or Clinton's immigration legislation, which introduced harsher immigration controls than the Republican presidencies of Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush, or Clinton's advocacy of introducing China into the World Trade Organization. I mean, the list goes on, and it really does feel like a litany of failures. But what I think is quite interesting about this book is that although this book doesn't deny any of that, and it does do a very good job of sort of tracing all of those policies, it argues that Clinton didn't intend to necessarily be a right-wing neoliberal president when he entered the White House in 1993. In fact, Liechtenstein, I think, put forward a pretty convincing argument that Clinton had some social democratic sympathies, and that he included in his administration people who were truly of the center-left. And what happened, I suppose, part of what they argue in this book, is that the congressional politics of the time was such that Clinton didn't have a great deal of support for those social democratic policies in Congress, but he could build coalitions with Republicans and conservative Democrats on these more centrist, neoliberal, or even right-wing policies. And Clinton decided to be a president of substance and someone who achieved things, even if that meant not necessarily implementing policies that a traditional New Deal Democrat would believe in. And it's an interesting question, really, for politicians. You know, if you were given the choice between doing nothing and being a politician remembered for being a failure who couldn't get anything through, would you prefer that to being a politician who was remembered for making all kinds of compromises on your political beliefs, but you were able to actually pass legislation and change the direction of travel in the country in a certain way? So, Lee, what are you reading about at the moment?
I'm still reading the book that I was reading last week. So I thought I'd talk this week about a book that I read a little while ago, but I dipped into recently because I've been looking at the fall of Theresa May and the election of Boris Johnson in 2019. And so the book I was looking into for that was Rory Stewart's memoir of political life, which I think is a very interesting book. I also think it sold incredibly well when it was published. So some thoughts from me. First of all, if you were being unkind to Stewart, you would say that he is basically an ego attached to a human body. I mean, it might be unkind, but at several times in the book, you begin to think that that's probably right. For example, when he's trying to become a Conservative MP, he goes and meets David Cameron and basically says to him, if I do this, I want to know that I'm going to be promoted and have real power as a minister. And Cameron basically turns around to him. I think Cameron's not that impressed, and says, if you were lucky enough to find a seat and be elected, you will find that being a backbench member of Parliament is the greatest honour you can have in your life. I think Cameron comes out of that exchange rather better than Stewart, who, of course, did not have a background in politics at this stage. Of course, Stewart does get a seat, he does get elected, and he does, in fact, get promoted. He ends up in the cabinet. And to be fair, I think when reading this book, I saw Stewart as a good example of what you would often want from a minister. He doesn't just accept the briefing he gets. He agitates against things that he thinks are wrong. He tries to think outside of the box and be innovative in terms of policy. It's striking how often he comes up against the civil service as he's trying to do this, and they often serve as almost a block on him. And it rather contrasts, I think, sometimes with the impression that fans of Stuart might like to give of the way government worked, where you get some wicked Tories like Boris Johnson who are enemies of the civil service, enemies of established decency, and then Tories like Rory Stewart who were much more on the civil servant side and on the side of sort of decency and the traditional British way of doing things. But that's really not what we see here, in fact. Stuart makes many of the arguments you would expect some of the Brexiteers or someone like Dominic Cummings to perhaps make about the way the civil service functions. Although, of course, he had different ways of articulating that and eventually addressing it. But that's in some ways the thing that really stood out most to me about the book, is that even when he gets promoted, the challenge of making the change that he wants to see happen. The book is well written, undoubtedly. It's engrossing. It's quite honest in places, I think, about his own flaws. So it deserved to sell well. It deserves to be read. And, I found that a very compelling read. We'll have the links to all of our chosen books in the show notes, but that's all from us this week. We'll be back next week with another dip into Britain's post-war political history. Do join us then.
Thanks very much.